Study Session 11, The Middle East in International Politics. Introduction. In this study session, we shall examine the nature of Middle East in global affairs, especially in the areas of Arab nationalism, the Cold War, modern ideologies, foreign policy, international political economy, terrorism, and Arab revolutions. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to analyze the Middle East within international politics. Historical background of the Middle East. The Middle East is a region of stable state entities. Its boundaries and constituent states have been relatively constant in modern times, far more than, for example, 20th century Europe or East Asia. At the dawn of the 21st century, the Middle East and North Africa comprised a world of nearly 400 million people, divided into 21 states. The majority of these states, 18 in all, were Arab, while 3 others were respectively Turkish, Iranian, and Israeli. On its frontiers were other countries, historically and strategically separate, but linked by culture, belief, and trade. In analysis of the internal and international politics of a region subjected to foreign domination, it is evidently tempting to ascribe everything to external forces. Compared with centuries of domination in Latin America and South Asia, the period of formal European colonialism in the Middle East was short-lived. The former Ottoman territories, appropriated after the First World War, were given independence within a decade or two. Iraq in 1932, Egypt in 1936, Jordan in 1946. Hint: the Middle East comprises also some countries historically and strategically separate, but linked by culture, belief, and trade. You should know that many of the most influential studies of Middle Eastern politics and international relations are rightly concerned with the role of culture and ideology in shaping the region. What is ideology? In a narrow sense, ideology refers to sets of explicit or systematic beliefs about politics. Typical examples will be political ideologies of the 20th century: socialism, communism, fascism, populism, and also broader sets of political beliefs such as nationalism or religious fundamentalism. Of considerable importance to the Middle East, these ideologies may be those of groups resisting established states and calling for alternative forms of government, or those of established states seeking to reinforce their claim to legitimacy. Some ideologies, especially in the mid-20th century, have been secular, drawing on modern concepts of the state, people, or community. Others, especially from the 1970s, have been religious, using terms from Islamic tradition or those of various forms of Christianity or of Judaism. International political economy of oil. Oil played a significant role in the international political economy of the Middle East. Middle Eastern oil was discovered first in southern Iran in 1908, then in Iraq and Arabian Peninsula countries. Production in Saudi Arabia began in 1939, in Kuwait in 1946. Oil certainly transformed the place of the Middle East in the world economy, and whatever else guaranteed a continued attention by the outside to the affairs of the region. In particular, as the United States, which had earlier been largely self-sufficient in oil, became from the 1970s a major energy importer, so the power of the Middle Eastern producers in the world market became stronger. Several consequences across the range of international political economy followed from this oil boom. Hint: oil certainly transformed the place of the Middle East in the world economy, and whatever else guaranteed a continued attention by the outside to the affairs of the region. In the first place, oil shaped the social character of the state and by derivation of the economy. Thus, the states which possessed oil derived from it an increasingly important income and came to depend largely on that income. Secondly, while it was not in itself a source of conflict, oil did provoke a political reaction within societies. In this context, the development of the oil industry and the issue of ownership of oil became objects of great dispute within Middle Eastern countries, as well as between these countries and the West. As Western policy in the Middle East was increasingly seen as dictated by the desire to control oil production, this led to strong nationalist reaction. The crisis in Iran between 1951 and 1953 was precipitated by the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to nationalize oil. This attempt was first followed by an international boycott of Iranian oil that weakened the Iranian economy, and then the overthrow of Mossadegh in the 1953 coup organized by the USA and Britain. This is according to Halliday 2005. One thing that ought to bother students of international politics is the imposition of large number of actors in a complex market, and the determinant actors in the Middle Eastern oil production were necessarily states, producers, and consumers. This had long been so for the great powers. Britain made control of oil a strategic priority when in 1914 the British Navy switched from reliance on coal to reliance on oil. While oil and the attempt to control it were not causes of global or regional conflict, there were significant factors in the definition of strategy in both world wars, that is, the First World War and the Second World War. For example, the British drive through Iraq between 1915 and 1917 and the German attack to break through Soviet lines to the Caucasus between 1941 and 1942 were results of the wish to monopolize oil fields. However, in 1960, something else happened. The Middle Eastern oil producers and other states, such as Venezuela, set up the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, with the aim of negotiating jointly with the oil companies over prices. It was to be another decade before, in 1971, OPEC was able significantly to alter the price of oil. In 1973, however, in connection with the global shortage and of a political crisis precipitated by the Arab-Israeli war in October, OPEC members were able to raise prices by 400%. The December 1973 price of $14 was equal in terms of the late 1990s to $90 per barrel. In the same period, and reflecting a shift in attitude In both the region and the West, the oil-producing states were able to take over and in effect nationalize the oil companies. The concessionary state had now become the producer and rentier state. The changes of the early 1970s did not, however, end political controversy over oil. The cartel of producer states in OPEC still had to operate within a framework of other stronger consumer states and of a shifting global structure, the energy market. In the first place, the oil-producing states remained almost wholly reliant on the international oil companies for downstream, marketing, or operations. Secondly, OPEC had not succeeded in sustaining the prices earlier raised. Thirdly, in the 1980s, divisions developed within OPEC between population-rich countries, e.g., Iran, Iraq, which wanted to maximize output, and low population states, e.g., Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, which wanted to conserve oil resources. Hint: the oil-producing states in Middle East were able to take over and in effect nationalize oil companies. The concessionary state had now become the producer and rentier state. Similarly, after 1973, OPEC states encountered policy obstacles, the limits of political economy both internationally and internally. While they found it difficult to convert their market control of the early 1970s into a permanent international level, they found it even harder to use their natural wealth to further broaden foreign policy goals. In the first place, the possession of oil did not produce a common foreign policy. Iran quarreled with the Arab world and Iraq with Kuwait. Secondly, those states, notably Saudi Arabia, which sought to use their oil wealth to win influence in the Arab world, found this to be a dubious weapon. Egypt, whose break with the Soviet Union was in part financed by the Saudis in the early 1970s, disobeyed the Saudi advice in making peace with Israel between 1977 and 1979. Even between 1990 and 1991, many of the Islamic militants who had till then been funded by Saudi Arabia disobeyed Saudi and supported Iraq in the confrontation over Kuwait. The implication of this is that politics and economics were interwoven in the Middle East affairs, and this affected its relations with the rest of the world. Cold War and the Middle East. After the Second World War, Jewish nationalists or Zionists waged a successful war against the British and the Arabs for a homeland in Palestine. In defense of this action, they cited historical, biblical, and legal authority and urged that in the aftermath of the war, Jews could live in security only in a Jewish homeland. After more than a decade of severe hostilities, another war erupted. In 1967, Israel apparently gained much of what it wanted in the region and internationally. In the Middle East, the Arab world was divided and defeated. The Palestinians appeared on the run. In terms of the Cold War, Israel, more than ever aligned with the West, had enjoyed the almost unanimous backing of Western public opinion. While the USSR broke up diplomatic relations with Israel when the war began, the USA and US public opinion endorsed Israel's action in this war to a degree far greater than in the two earlier Arab-Israeli conflicts. Indeed, American reservations about a strategic alliance with Israel and about Israel's pursuit of nuclear weapons were reduced. Instead, Israel came increasingly to be seen as an ally in the Cold War against Soviet influence. What is observable is that Israel and its friend in Washington made sure the message was driven home. As a consequence, the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, launched by Egypt in October 1973, was interpreted in Washington as part of a Soviet assault on Western interests. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in June 1982 was given at least an indirect encouragement from a Reagan administration keen to go after Soviet allies, in this case Syria and the PLO in the Third World. The allying of Arab-Israeli dispute with the Cold War was compounded by other developments in the 1970s and 1980s. One was the issue of Palestinian military action. In an argument that won some favor in Washington, the rise of Palestinian guerrilla resistance after 1967 was presented by Israel as a form of international terrorism, itself a product of Soviet hostility to the West. At the same time, in the early 1970s, criticism rose within the USA over the refusal of the USSR to permit the emigration of Soviet Jews. This appeared to see Moscow not only as an opponent of Israel, but as enemy of Jewish people in general. However, this sealing of Israel into the Cold War system after 1967 did not produce stability in the region. The alignment of Israel with the USA and the apparent Cold War support Israel received did not in the longer run resolve the political and strategic challenges it faced. The first problem was to its north. From 1975, Lebanon had been beset by civil war, a coalition of Arab nationalists, Muslim and Palestinian forces being aligned against a coalition led by Maronite Christians. In 1976, in order to offset the power of the nationalist Muslim and Palestinian bloc, Syria intervened in the conflict, committing one of the greatest single atrocities of post-1945 Middle East history, the slow death through dehydration of thousands of Palestinians at the camp of Tel el-Zatar. From 1978 onwards, Israel too sought to play a role in Lebanon. It aimed to destroy the PLO and establish a friendly state based on the Maronite goals it did not achieve. At the same time, its peace with Egypt yielded little in the way of broader normalization with the Arab world. Most strikingly, the Palestinian issue refused to go away. Perhaps it will interest you to know a little bit of the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. During this period, each side accused the other of harboring imperialistic designs. The Arab states, along with the Palestinian Liberation Organization (PLO), repeatedly avowed their intention to destroy Israel, thereby rejecting the status quo of the Middle East. But Israel too occasionally acted to alter the local and regional balance of power, as when it permitted the establishment of Jewish settlements on lands seized from the Arabs. Tip: In 1976, in order to offset the power of the nationalist Muslim and Palestinian bloc, Syria had intervened in the conflict, committing one of the greatest single atrocities of post-1945 Middle East history, the slow death through dehydration of thousands of Palestinians at the camp of Tel el-Zatar. Interestingly, each side constantly sought to justify its position on the ground that it was merely maintaining its power. Arab critics claimed the moral high ground, asserting that they were simply defending the Palestinians' rights to self-determination. The Israelis, on the other hand, cited the moral obligations to safeguard their rights to exist as a sovereign nation. The concluding part of this topic is that the crisis that erupted in the Middle East had their impact on East-West relations during the Cold War era. Terrorism. Another Middle East political phenomenon is international terrorism. On the 11th of September 2001, attacks were made on the United States of America by an underground military grouping, Al-Qaeda, which had been formed earlier in the 1990s in Afghanistan. This group had arisen out of the fundamentalist jihadist currents that had fought the Soviet forces in Afghanistan in the 1980s, while it drew its support from recruits around the Muslim world and proclaimed a corresponding ideology. The Islamist group embodied that fusion of different causes: Palestine, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kashmir, that formed the popular, lived and West-hating dimensions of the greater West Asian crisis. This group appeals to the Ummah and the general war with the Kufr, that is, the infidels, laid the foundation of terrorism as a form of political violence. Its leaders were Arabs, Saudis, and Egyptians, and its goal was political: to take power in Arab states, specifically Saudi Arabia. Thus, confrontation with the West and rhetoric of militant jihad was determined by that strategy. The major reason why terrorism is mostly associated with the Middle East is the confrontation between the Arabs and the West countries. Read Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. However, appealing to terrorism is a form of strategy to win international support. Arab Revolution. The 2010 to 2011 Middle East and North Africa protests are an unprecedented revolutionary wave of demonstrations and protests which have been taking place in the Middle East and North Africa since 18th of December 2010. The demonstrations and uprisings in the region have been called the Arab Spring. The protest began on the 18th of December 2010 in Tunisia, following Mohamed Bouaziz's self-immolation in protest of police corruption and ill-treatment. Due to similar hardships in the region and ultimately successful protests in Tunisia, a chain of unrests was started, which was followed by protests in Algeria, Jordan, Egypt, and Yemen, and to a lesser degree in other mostly Arab states. The protests in the region have also affected unrests outside the region. To date, 2 heads of states have been overthrown: Tunisia's on the 14th of January and Egypt's on the 11th of February 2011. Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution led President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali to flee to Saudi Arabia. In Egypt, Massive protests began on the 25th of January, and after 18 days of protests, President Hosni Mubarak, who had ruled Egypt for 30 years, resigned on the 11th of February 2011. Around the same time, Jordan's king, Abdullah, named a new prime minister, and the president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, announced that he would not seek another term in office in 2013, after what will then be 35 years of rule. During the ongoing uprising against Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi, Sudanese President Omar el-Bashir announced he will not seek re-election in 2015. Despite Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki announcing he would not seek re-election in 2014, increasingly violent demonstrations urging him to resign have mounted. Finally, both the volatility of the protests and their profound geopolitical implications have drawn global attention and excitement. In the same vein, as many of the world's major oil-producing countries are in the Middle East, the unrest has sent oil prices higher. In the same vein, as many of the world's major oil-producing countries are in the Middle East, the unrest has sent oil prices higher. Study session summary. In this study session, we explored the historical background of the Middle East, and we noted that it is a very important region in global affairs. Many of the most influential studies of the region's politics and international relations are concerned with the role of culture and ideology which shaped the region. Oil played a significant role in the international political economy of the Middle East. Similarly, the Cold War affected the Middle East politics, especially the Arab-Israeli conflicts. In addition, the confrontation between the Arabs and the West created an avenue for the terrorist action of the Islamic fundamentalists. The current Arab Revolution showed the geopolitical relevance of the Middle East in global politics, especially the price of oil in the international market. End of study session 11. Thanks for listening.